I have 3 e4 gambits to show you that absolutely destroy beginner players. I'll show you one against the Sicilian, against the Scandinavian, and last but not least, against the most popular e4, e5 opening. So first off, we're going to take a look at our response to the Sicilian defense, c5. They control the center, stopping d4, but again, we're going to play it anyway. They'll take, and then we start our gambit by playing c3. They take, and we recapture with the knight. If they deny the gambit in any way, it's really great for white. You get a massive center. They really get punished for not accepting the gambit, but most players here will accept it. So the general plans to remember is you're essentially going knight f3, bishop c4, and then lining up possible sacrifices there. And you're always looking for e5 pushes as well to kind of set it up. So the simplest e5 push to remember is if they play the immediate knight f6, we can push e5, and it's very similar to the Vienna. Because our knight here controls these two squares, and our queen is lined up on this diagonal, this knight has no squares, it's forced back, and you have a massive lead in development. So that's the easiest one to remember, but there's a lot more fun variations where this e5 push gets you a great position. So for example, if they play d6, getting ready to control that square, you can play bishop c4, and now if they play knight f6, you push e5 anyway. It looks like a pawn sacrifice, so if they take, you sacrifice your bishop, the king has to take, and then you win the queen right out of the opening. My favorite line to remember is against the accelerated dragon, g6. This is really popular because a lot of YouTubers recommend it for the black side, but it doesn't work against the Mora unless you know exactly what you're doing. We play bishop c4, they fianchetto their bishop, and then you want to remember this queen b3 move. It sets up this battery here, and it also pressures that pawn, which can come in handy later. Almost everyone will play e6 here, but it creates these really weak dark squares that we're going to go after. We play knight b5, and already this king is in so much trouble. You'll actually see the top engine move is to just preemptively move your king to the side, because there's actually no way to stop it. A lot of people will try and like bring the queen out here to try and make something work, but you can see from the eval bar, it doesn't work in the slightest. You block with your bishop, and again, this knight is just going to be a disaster for black, and it's a lot of fun. You win so many games straight out of the opening. So lastly, I'll run you through the general setup if black knows exactly how to avoid all these opening traps. So they might play knight c6, we play bishop c4, they blunt our bishop with e6, which is really important for the black side. We play knight f3, they play d6, controlling our e5 push, we castle, and they start developing. The maneuver to remember is you want to play queen e2 and then rook d1. So queen e2, develop their bishop, rook d1, and if they castle here, it's already a big mistake because e5 is again available. It's because this pawn is pinned because of the rook here, and black just gets tangled in this really passive position. It doesn't work out for them. So not many people are going to know this, but the theoretical move is then to play e5, stopping our push here. And then the setup to remember is you want to put your bishop on e3. The reason is this is the weak square in the Mora, and you want to be careful of this knight jumping forward and forking these two pieces, especially if the bishop ends up here. So this bishop's super important here. Other than that, you bring the rook to c1, and you'll just eventually win this pawn back or create a strong kingside attack by pushing f4. You can see we have plenty of conversation for the pawn still. Even if you don't win out of the opening, it's a really solid system and such a fun way to play with white against the Sicilian. The next line we'll look at is against the Scandinavian defense, d5. This immediately contests the center, attacking our undefended e4 pawn, but we don't care. We're just going to play d4, transposing into the Black Mardima Gambit. This is more popular to happen in the d4 opening, so a lot of Scandinavian players aren't ready for this at all. So they'll take, and I'll show you first the really fun line to get a super quick checkmate out of the opening. So you want to play f3, inviting them to take, and you take back with your knight, getting a lead in development. They pin your knight, and you ignore it. You play bishop c4, and if they continue developing, you have a queen sacrifice line, playing knight e5. Basically, if they take your queen, you have checkmate straight out of the opening on f7. This will happen so much in bullet, in the beginner rounds. It's a lot of fun. One thing to know in this early f3 variation is if we go back to here, black has this really annoying move, e5. It's kind of like a counter gambit. It takes all the fun out because they're looking to trade queens, and you don't want this. So what I like to play personally is I'll start with knight c3. They'll play knight f6. and then you play f3, offering up this position. And I'll run you through the general plans. So let's say they start developing normally. You can put your bishop on c4 if you want to, but generally they'll play e6, and you're kind of biting on granite here. So I like to play bishop d3 and not be in too much of a rush to win in the first few moves. So they'll play passive, we can castle, they can castle. And the general maneuver to remember is you're always looking for this queen e1 to then queen h4 maneuver. And it's extra strong if they bring their bishop out here, because you can basically pile up on this knight. And in general, this knight and going for checkmate on this square is the big plan in this system. There's always rook sacrifices you can go for. Like I was saying, you bring the queen out to here, you just get a lot of pressure on the king side, and you're going for a quick checkmate. So try this out against Scandinavian players. Like I said, they're not ready for it, and you'll have a lot of fun doing it. And the final gambit we'll talk about, the most common one you'll get to play with, is the Danish gambit. They start e5, controlling the d4 square, but again, we don't care. We play d4, let them take, and then we offer up our c3 pawn as the gambit. They'll take, and there's two ways to play. So you can play gambiting 2 pawns with bishop c4, and when they take, you take back with your bishop, and you just get these diagonals. It's a lot of fun. If you're below 1000 elo, you'll crush everyone. It's ridiculous. And I had a lot of fun with that as well. But as you go up the ranks, people are a lot more prepared for that, and it's a bit easier to shut down. I actually like to play the immediate knight c3. It's a lot more solid. The engine likes it a bit more as well, which is nice for analyzing after the game. And I'll show you, there's still plenty of ways you can checkmate your opponent in this. So it's very similar to the Mora as well, which means you'll get heaps of experience playing both these lines. So if they play knight f6, we have e5, and it's the same deal. This knight can't push forward. They have to go back, and they're having no fun at all. So like the Mora, our bishop generally belongs on c4. It's a lot stronger here, though, because they can't ever play e6. So all these same kind of sacrificial ideas, they come into effect. And queen b3 is even stronger because, again, that pawn is just so much harder to defend. So a fun line to remember is they play knight c6, and you develop your knight, and they pin your knight. Queen b3 is really strong here. It forks these 2 pawns, and you're in a great position. And a really common trap, which a lot of black players fall into and make the mistake, is they'll take this knight. They think that you have to take back and ruin your kingside structure, but they don't realize that this is just checkmate in 2. So you'll win a lot of games like that. Even if they don't, let's say they try and defend by putting the queen here. Well, now you take that pawn, and both these pieces are hanging. So it's really tough for black. There's so many lines like this in the Danish. It's really fun. There's one last line I want to show you before we show the general setups, and this is my favorite to play against in the Danish. It's the immediate bishop b4. So a lot of players will play this because you've sacrificed a pawn to get this early knight developed, so they think they're neutralizing this by pinning it, and the best move here is queen d4. So this attacks the bishop, but a lot of people miss that it also forks that pawn. So you'll see knight c6 here a lot, and then you take the pawn, and then players will think they're clever. They're holding everything together with this queen f6 move, which looks great, but then there's this super tricky bishop h6, which just looks silly, but basically black is kind of paralyzed. There's no real good moves here. If they take the bishop, they hang their queen, which happens a lot. If they take the queen, you take back and you win the rook. And if they do nothing, which has happened a few times, like let's just say they start developing normally, you have this check here, and it's not quite checkmate in this variation, but there's just so many fun ways, remembering that h6 move. And even if they don't, even if they take the knight straight away, you take back with the queen, and straight out of the opening, you have the bishop pair, you have plenty of compensation for the pawn, and you'll have a fun game. And the last line I'll show you before the sunlight in front of me completely fades me away against my green screen, I'm sorry about that, is just the general setup. So let's go back to the start here. So the most solid setup is they'll play bishop c5, you develop your bishop, and then they defend it. Again, there's so many traps in this variation. Another one just is if they play knight c6, you immediately have this bishop sacrifice, because you'll win it right back, winning that undefended bishop. So you honestly will not have to play a normal game very much at all in the Danish. But if they defend, you just develop normally, let them develop normally, and we have this position. And it's the same deal. You're not in a rush to win anything back. You've sacrificed a pawn, but I'm sure you know, unless you're at a GM, IM level, sacrificing one pawn really won't decide the game. Just make sure you don't trade too many pieces. You can go for a kingside attack. You can play in the center with rook e1. There's a lot of options. It's mostly just don't try and force anything too hard. You don't have to. There's plenty of compensation for the pawn. You can see even the edge-in only has a slight advantage for black if they do everything perfectly. Thanks for watching. Let me know in the comments if you want to see more in-depth videos on any of the 3 openings we've seen here today. Other than that, please like and subscribe. And there should be a video somewhere here showing the Joe Bava London, which is a really fun aggressive opener, similar to the ones we've seen today, but starts out with d4.